Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Let yourself settle in somewhere comfortable as we journey together through one of the most remarkable tales in all of Warhammer 40,000. Dim the lights if you wish. Let the sounds of the world around you fade into the background. Take a deep breath and release the tensions of your day. For the next while, we travel to the grim darkness of the far future, to a galaxy torn by endless warfare, where humanity clings to survival against threats that would drive lesser species to extinction. This is a story about what it means to be human in an inhuman galaxy. It is a story about courage, about perseverance, about the power of will over circumstance. It is a story about a man who became a legend, and about the legend that outlived the man. And most remarkably, it is a story about respect between enemies, and about the strange bond that forms when two warriors recognize in each other something worthy of admiration. And within that galaxy of horrors, we find one of the most inspiring stories ever told. The story of a man who should have been forgotten, who should have been just another casualty in the endless meat grinder of galactic conflict, but who instead became something extraordinary. A man who earned the respect of an enemy that respects nothing but strength. There is a saying among the greenskins of the galaxy, passed from warlord to warlord, from the howling war bands of feral tribes to the massive armadas that blot out the stars. It is spoken in guttural tones around campfires made from burning cities, whispered by mechs as they hammer together their ramshackle engines of destruction, and bellowed by war bosses as they lead their boys into the teeth of enemy fire. It has been passed down through generations of greenskins, spreading from the veterans of the Armageddon Wars to young boys who have never seen the human who inspired it. The saying goes something like this: Humies is all weak scum that deserve to get stomped, except for One-Eye Yarrick. He knows how to fight. Those words came from the mouth of Gaz-Kul Mag Uruk Thraka himself, perhaps the most dangerous orc to have threatened the Imperium since the beast arose in the 32nd Millennium. Coming from any other source, such praise for a human would mean nothing, would be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. But coming from Gaz-Kul, from the prophet of the Great Green Crusade, from the warlord who has burned worlds and shattered armies beyond counting, from the being whom some say is touched by the orc gods Gork and Mork themselves, those words carry a weight that defies easy explanation. They speak to something extraordinary, something that transcends the usual boundaries between humanity and the savage xenos that infest the galaxy. Tonight, we explore the legend of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, the man known to his people as the Old Man, the title given to him by the billions of citizens of Armageddon who owe their lives to his sacrifice. The hero called the Savior of Armageddon, whose name is spoken with reverence across the Imperium. The warrior the Orks have come to know as Old Baal Eye, whose very gaze they believe carries death. His story spans centuries of warfare, encompassing some of the greatest conflicts in Imperial history. It is a tale of survival against impossible odds, of willpower that borders on the supernatural, and of a rivalry so profound that it transcends the usual hatred between species. It is, in its way, a love story, though not the kind poets typically sing about. It is the love of war itself, the respect that only true warriors can share, and the strange bond that forms when two souls are destined to clash again and again across the blood-soaked fields of battle. To understand Yarrick, you must first understand what he represents. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, where the Imperium of man stands as a rotting edifice maintained only through the sacrifice of countless billions, heroes are rare and precious things. Or the average human in this age lives a life of crushing labor, grinding poverty, and inevitable death in service to a god-emperor who sits silent upon a golden throne. They are born to serve, to work, to die, and to be forgotten. Their names are lost to history, as surely as their bones are ground to dust beneath the wheels of progress. But sometimes, just sometimes, a human rises above their station, not through genetic modification like the Astartes, nor through the dark blessings of the ruinous powers, nor through the arcane technologies of the Mechanicus. Sometimes a human becomes legendary through nothing more than the strength of their will, the fire of their conviction, and the utter refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems inevitable. Sebastian Yarrick is such a man, and his story begins, as so many stories do, with tragedy. The world of Taos III was an unremarkable planet in an unremarkable system, the kind of place that rarely warranted mention in the vast archives of the Administratum. Its people lived simple lives, working the land and the factories, paying their tithes to the Imperium, and praying to the God Emperor for protection from the horrors that lurked in the darkness between the stars. Among those people was a family named Varden, and within that family was a boy named Sebastian. Sebastian Varden was orphaned at the age of 7. The circumstances of his parents' deaths are not recorded in any official history, lost to time as so many details are in a galaxy where billions die every day. What is recorded is what came after. The young orphan was taken in by his maternal grandfather, as a man named Yarrick, who had served as a sergeant in the Imperial Guard before retiring to spend his final years in peace. If there was any peace to be found on Taos III, the old soldier found it in raising his grandson. For 3 years, the elder Yarrick poured everything he knew into the boy. Not the gentle education of scholars, but the harsh lessons of survival that only a veteran of the Emperor's armies could provide. He taught Sebastian how to lay traps in the wilderness, how to hide from predators both animal and human, how to fight when fighting was necessary, and how to run when discretion proved the better part of valor. He taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He taught him that duty was not a burden to be shirked, but a privilege to be embraced. And most importantly, that he taught him that the enemies of mankind were legion, and that every human had a responsibility to stand against them. The boy learned his lessons well, perhaps too well, for he would soon have cause to put them into practice. There is something worth noting about the relationship between Sebastian and his grandfather during those formative years. The elder Yarrick was not a gentleman by any measure. He had seen too much, survived too much, lost too many comrades on too many battlefields to approach child-rearing with softness. But there was love in his methods, even if it manifested in ways that might seem harsh by civilian standards. Every lesson in survival was a gift, a piece of knowledge that might one day save the boy's life. Every training session, no matter how exhausting, was an investment in a future that the old soldier knew could turn deadly at any moment. The elder Yarrick understood something that many Imperial citizens never grasp. The galaxy is not a safe place, and it never will be. The thin veneer of civilization that covers most Imperial worlds is exactly that, a veneer, easily stripped away by the slightest touch of war or catastrophe. Those who cannot adapt, who cannot fight, who cannot survive on their own, when the structures of society collapse around them, those people die. And Yarrick refused to let his grandson be among them. Sebastian absorbed these lessons with the intensity that would later define his entire career. He was not a naturally gifted physical specimen. There are no records suggesting he was larger or stronger or faster than other children his age. What set him apart was something less tangible but far more important. He refused to quit. When a training exercise left him exhausted, he pushed through the exhaustion. When he failed at a task, he tried again and again and again until he succeeded. This quality, this absolute refusal to accept defeat, would prove more valuable than any physical advantage could ever be. The Orks came to Taos III without warning, as Orks so often do. Their ramshackle fleet emerged from the warp like a pestilence, disgorging hordes of howling greenskins onto the unprepared world. The planetary defense forces were overwhelmed within days. Communications with the wider Imperium were severed. Millions died in the initial assault, and millions more would follow in the weeks and months to come. The elder Yarrick was among the early casualties. Well, we do not know the circumstances of his death, whether he fell defending his home or was simply caught in the tide of destruction that swept across the planet. What we do know is that his 10-year-old grandson survived where so many others did not. And in that survival, a legend began to take shape. For 3 years, young Sebastian lived alone in the wilderness of Taos 3. 3 years of hiding from the greenskins who had claimed his world as their own. 3 years of laying traps to kill Gretchen and Squigs, of foraging for food in the ruins of civilization, of doing everything necessary to survive in a world that had become a living nightmare. He used every trick his grandfather had taught him and invented new ones when the old ones proved insufficient. He became a ghost, a shadow. He had a persistent thorn in the side of any orc unlucky enough to wander into his territory. Imagine what that must have been like. A child of 10 years, alone in a world conquered by savage alien invaders, with no hope of rescue and no expectation of survival. Most children in that situation would have died within days, either killed by the orcs or starving in the ruins of their former homes. Even adults, trained soldiers, often fell quickly when isolated behind enemy lines. But Sebastian Yarrick not only survived, he thrived. The key to his survival was adaptability. When one hiding place became unsafe, he found another. When a particular trap design stopped working because the orcs had learned to avoid it, he developed new designs. When food became scarce in one area, he moved to another, while always staying one step ahead of the green tide that had swallowed his world. He learned to read the signs of orc activity, predicting their movements based on subtle clues that most humans would never notice. He learned which areas they avoided and why, using that knowledge to create safe havens that the greenskins would not think to search. But survival was not the only thing Sebastian learned during those years. He also learned to study the enemy. He watched the orcs from hidden vantage points, observing their behavior, their hierarchies, their strange rituals and brutal customs. He listened to their guttural speech until the sounds began to make a terrible kind of sense. He learned, in short, how orcs think, how they fight, and how they can be beaten. This knowledge would prove invaluable in the decades to come. The orcs of Taos. 3 came to know of the human ghost who haunted their conquered territory. They spoke of traps that appeared from nowhere, of patrols that went out and never returned, of a presence in the wilderness that killed without being seen. Some of the younger and more superstitious orcs began to whisper that the planet was haunted, that some malevolent spirit lurked in the ruins of human civilization and took revenge on any greenskin foolish enough to venture alone into its domain. They were right, in a sense. The spirit's name was Sebastian. When the Imperial Relief Flotilla finally arrived at Taos 3 several months later, guard regiments were deployed to reclaim what remained of the world. One patrol squad stumbled upon a lone survivor, a boy of 10 years, who by all rights should have been dead 100 times over. Yet he was thin, scarred, wild-eyed, and possessed of a survival instinct that bordered on the feral. But there was something else in those eyes as well, something that caught the attention of the commissar attached to the patrol, a fire that suggested this boy was destined for more than the ordinary fate of an imperial orphan. It was at this moment that Sebastian Varden took a new name. He claimed his grandfather's surname as his own, honoring the man who had given him the tools to survive and the will to use them. From that day forward, he would be known as Sebastian Yarrick, and the Schola Progenium awaited. The Schola Progenium is where the Imperium forges many of its most devoted servants. Commissars, stormtroopers, administrators, and other essential functionaries of the vast imperial machine are shaped within its walls, and molded from orphans and foundlings into instruments of the Emperor's will. For young Yarrick, it was both prison and salvation. The rigid discipline and constant indoctrination were a far cry from the wild freedom of his survival years on Taos 3. but they provided something he had lacked since his grandfather's death: purpose. The transition was not easy. After 3 years of surviving by his wits alone, answering to no authority but his own, the structured environment of the Schola Progenium must have felt suffocating at first. Every hour was scheduled, every action was regulated, every thought was examined for signs of deviation from approved imperial doctrine. Where Sebastian had once made all his own decisions, now those decisions were made for him by instructors who demanded absolute obedience. But Yarrick was nothing if not adaptable. He recognized that the Schola Progenium was simply another environment to be mastered, another set of challenges to be overcome. The skills he had developed during his survival years, the ability to observe, to learn, to adapt, served him well in this new setting. Where other students struggled against the rigid discipline, Yarrick embraced it. He understood that the structure was not designed to break him, but to build him into something stronger. The instructors noticed this unusual student almost immediately. Most orphans who entered the Schola Progenium were broken in some way, traumatized by whatever events had left them without parents. They needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, their old identities erased and new ones constructed in their place. Yarrick was different. He arrived already forged, already hardened, already possessing the core of what the Schola Progenium sought to create. His instructors did not need to break him, they merely needed to refine him. Yarrick excelled in his studies, not in the quiet, contemplative way of scholars, but in the fierce, driven manner of a warrior determined to master every skill that might help him defeat the enemies of mankind. He learned tactics and strategy, the history of the Imperium's many wars, the weaknesses of its countless foes. He trained his body until it became a weapon, hardening his muscles and sharpening his reflexes through endless hours of combat drills. And he cultivated the force of personality that would one day make him one of the most inspiring leaders in Imperial history. His fellow progenitor knew him well. He and a young man named Dominic Seroff became particularly close, the two of them earning something of a reputation in their dormitory for their intensity and competitive spirit. They pushed each other to ever greater heights of achievement, each determined not to be outdone by the other. It was the kind of friendship that the Schola both encouraged and discouraged, useful for motivating its students, but potentially dangerous if it bred softness or divided loyalties. Initially, Yarrick was trained to become a stormtrooper, one of the elite soldiers of the Militarum Tempestus, who serve as the Imperium's precision strike force. He served in this capacity for several years after graduation, participating in operations that remain classified in the archives of the Departamento Munitorum. But something about the role did not suit him. Stormtroopers are the Emperor's scalpel, precise and surgical in their application of violence. Yarrick was destined to be something different, something closer to a hammer. His transfer to the commissariat marked the true beginning of his legend. The role of a commissar is unique within the imperial military structure. They are not soldiers in the conventional sense, though they fight alongside soldiers in the most desperate battles. They are political officers, morale enforcers, living symbols of the Emperor's will and the Imperium's authority. Their job is to ensure that the men and women of the Astra Militarum fight with proper zeal, punishing cowardice and rewarding valor in equal measure. In the hands of a lesser individual, the commissar's bolt pistol becomes a tool of fear and oppression. In the hands of someone like Yarrick, it becomes something else entirely, a symbol of leadership by example. His first posting as a full commissar placed him under the tutelage of Lord Commissar Simeon Rasp, alongside his old friend Seroff. Together, the three were attached to the 77th Mortisian Infantry Regiment and sent to investigate a possible heretic uprising on the planet Mistral. What they found there was something far more sinister than simple rebellion. The conflict on Mistral pitted Yarrick against chaos cults, the fanatical warriors of the Adepta Sororitas, and the shadowy machinations of clandestine inquisitors. It was a crucible that tested everything he had learned and forced him to develop skills he did not know he possessed. But the most significant moment came at the conflict's conclusion. When Yarrick found himself face to face with something that no amount of training could have prepared him for, a demon of Tsinch. The encounter was brief and violent. The demons seized Yarrick, attempting to drag his soul into the nightmare realm of the warp. But the young commissar's faith held firm. Through sheer force of will and unwavering conviction in the Emperor's protection, Yarrick broke free of the demon's grasp, his soul intact, but forever marked by the experience. Some who study his history have suggested that this encounter changed Yarrick in ways that are difficult to quantify. Tzeentch is the chaos god of change, of fate, of manipulation, and cosmic plans that span millennia. Did the demon leave some mark upon Yarrick's destiny? Did the architect of fate, in that moment of contact, weave the commissar into some larger design? There is evidence that the demon's influence would touch Yarrick again in later years, subtle manipulations that seem to guide his steps towards certain pivotal moments. But whether this represents deliberate interference or simple coincidence remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that Yarrick emerged from Mistral a changed man. The experience hardened his faith and sharpened his hatred of the forces that threatened humanity. He threw himself into his duties with renewed fervor, serving in campaign after campaign across the galaxy. He fought alongside regiments from Necromunda, Luther McIntyre, and Armageddon, earning commendations and battle scars in equal measure. He led the 252nd Steel Legion on the moon of Ionos against heretic forces, and proving himself capable of independent command. And through it all, he continued to study the enemies of mankind, adding to the knowledge he had first gained as a survivor on Taos 3. But it was on Armageddon that destiny awaited. It was there that Yarrick would face the greatest challenge of his long career, and it was there that he would earn the respect of an enemy who respects nothing but strength. Armageddon. The name itself carries weight in the Imperial lexicon, conjuring images of apocalyptic battles and endless warfare. It is a hive world of vital strategic importance, a nexus of industry and transportation routes that makes it essential to the stability of the entire segmentum solar. Its vast manufactorums produce weapons of war in quantities that boggle the mind, its labor forces numbering in the billions, and its output feeding the endless hunger of the Imperium's military machine. To lose Armageddon would be a blow from which entire sectors might never recover. By the year 941 of the 41st Millennium, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick had served the Imperium for decades. His hair had turned grey, his face had grown lined with the marks of countless campaigns, and his body bore the scars of more wounds than he could easily count. He was, by any reasonable measure, an old man. His final assignment before planned retirement was to assist in the founding of the 4th Armageddon Regiment, a posting that should have been a peaceful conclusion to a distinguished career. Fate, it seems, had other plans. The first warnings came through the Emperor's Tarot, that strange tool of divination that the Imperium's psychers used to glimpse possible futures. The cards spoke of green tides and death, of fire raining from the sky and worlds drowned in blood. Freighter captains reported disturbances in the warp, strange currents that suggested something massive was moving toward Imperial space. The signs were unmistakable to anyone with eyes to see them. Unfortunately, the overlord of Armageddon was not such a man. Hermann von Straub has been called many things by many people over the centuries since his spectacular failures. Princeps Prime Curtiz Mannheim of the Iron Skull's Titan Legion described him as the greatest waste of flesh and bone born in the last 500 years. This assessment, while colourful, may actually be too generous. Von Straub was the product of Armageddon's noble houses. He'd elevated to his position through politics and family connections rather than merit or ability. He was vain, paranoid, incompetent, and utterly convinced of his own infallibility. When Yarrick saw the signs of what was coming, he recognized them for what they were. His years of studying Ork behavior, dating back to his childhood on Taos 3, told him that this was no ordinary raid. Something massive was approaching, a horde of greenskins, unlike anything Armageddon had faced in its history. He ordered the planet's astropaths to send a message to the wider Imperium. calling for reinforcements. Von Straub was furious. How dare a mere commissar circumvent his authority? How dare anyone suggest that Armageddon could not defend itself against a band of savage Xenos? In his pride and his foolishness, while the Overlord did two things that would doom his world to years of bloodshed. First, he insisted that Armageddon could handle whatever threat was coming without outside help. Second, he banished Yarrick to Hades' hive as punishment for his insubordination. In hindsight, this banishment may have been the only beneficial decision Hermann von Straub ever made. 1 month before the Orks landed, their space hulk emerged from the warp and smashed through Armageddon's pitiful orbital defenses like a fist through paper. The obsolete satellites and small attack craft that comprised the planet's first line of defense were swept aside without slowing the Green Tide's advance. 3 Space Marine chapters began organizing relief forces, but they would not arrive in time. By the time Imperial reinforcements could reach Armageddon, as the Orks would already be dug in deep. On the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, in the year 941 of the 41st Millennium, the Ork horde of Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka descended upon Armageddon. Millions died in the initial landing alone. The entire hive Uffen was destroyed when the Space Hulk Claw of Desolation crashed directly into it. And then, as if the gods themselves wished to ensure Armageddon's isolation, a massive warp storm formed around the system, cutting off all communication and travel with the wider Imperium. Armageddon was alone, and the Green Tide was only beginning to rise. The Ork invasion of Armageddon was not a single unified assault, but a coordinated catastrophe that struck the planet from multiple directions simultaneously. Gazkul's forces divided into 5 separate tribes, each pursuing its own objectives while contributing to the overall campaign. 2 tribes swept into Armageddon Prime, the northern region of the main continent, overwhelming the local defenses with sheer numbers and savage fury. The populations of the northern hives formed into defensive units and fortified around their homes, but they were pushed further and further back by the unstoppable Green Tide. Hermann von Straub's response to this crisis was precisely as incompetent as one might expect. He ordered piecemeal attacks against the advancing Orks, sending forces in small units that were easily surrounded and destroyed. He ignored the advice of experienced military commanders, including Princeps Mannheim, who urged him to consolidate his forces and prepare for a coordinated defense. But he remained convinced that his brilliance would somehow turn the tide, even as city after city fell to the invaders. When it became clear that Armageddon Prime could not be held, von Straub relocated his command center to Hive Tartarus in Armageddon Secundus. He assured everyone who would listen that the Orks would never cross the equatorial jungle region that separated the 2 halves. A massive armored columns of Orks charged, smashing through the thin Imperial lines that had been stretched too far by von Straub's incompetent deployments. Hive Infernus fell without a fight when its commanding officer, his nerve broken by the speed of the Ork advance, surrendered to save his own life. The refugee columns fleeing the fallen cities stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the ash wastes, only to be herded back by Ork biker units who took savage pleasure in the chase. Millions were captured and enslaved, put to work in the brutal conditions of Ork camps, where death was often the kindest fate available. But at Hades' hive, something different happened, something that would change the course of the war. Commissar Yarrick had been preparing since his arrival. Where von Straub saw punishment, Yarrick saw opportunity. But Hades' hive was a massive industrial complex, home to millions of workers, and surrounded by defensive positions that had been neglected but not destroyed. Its population included not just loyal Imperial citizens, but also the gangs of the Underhive, hardened fighters who knew every tunnel and corridor of their home. If these resources could be properly organized, Hades' hive might hold where other positions had crumbled. In the days and weeks following his banishment, Yarrick had done exactly that. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, supervising the welding shut of great blast portals that would slow the Ork advance, stockpiling ammunition and supplies in strategic locations throughout the hive, negotiating treaties with the gang leaders of the Underhive, who had never before shown loyalty to anything beyond their own territories. By the time the Orks reached Hades' hive, they found not a frightened populace waiting to be conquered, but a fortress prepared to fight to the last. The man who emerged from this crucible of preparation was not quite the same Yarrick who had arrived as an exile. Something in him had hardened, focused, crystallized into a force of will that seemed to defy the laws of nature. He had always been a leader, but now he became something more. He became a symbol, a living banner around which the desperate defenders of Hades' hive could rally. What followed was a siege that would become the stuff of legend. The Orks threw themselves at Hades' hive in wave after wave, only to be repulsed by defenders who fought with a ferocity that surprised even veteran greenskins. Every street became a killing ground. Every building became a fortress. Yet the vast industrial machinery of the hive was turned to war production, churning out weapons and ammunition even as battles raged within sight of the factory floors. And through it all, Commissar Yarrick was there, leading from the front, his presence turning fear into courage and despair into defiance. The conditions inside the besieged hive were beyond terrible. Food grew scarce as supply lines were cut. Water had to be carefully rationed as the Orks destroyed pumping stations and contaminated reservoirs. Medical supplies dwindled even as casualties mounted. The air itself became thick with the smoke of burning buildings and the stench of death. It was the kind of environment that breaks most defenders within weeks, that turns disciplined soldiers into desperate refugees seeking any escape from the nightmare. But the defenders of Hades' hive did not break. They endured, day after bloody day, week after brutal week, month after impossible month. They endured because Yarrick showed them how to endure. He shared their hardships, eating the same meager rations, drinking the same recycled water, breathing the same poisoned air. He was not a distant commander issuing orders from a safe bunker somewhere behind the lines. He was there, on the walls, in the streets, wherever the fighting was fiercest. His presence was a constant reminder that survival was possible, that victory was achievable, that the Emperor had not abandoned them. The psychology of what Yarrick accomplished during the siege deserves special consideration. Human beings are not naturally suited to prolonged combat. Our minds are designed to respond to threats with brief bursts of intense focus, followed by periods of recovery. When that recovery never comes, when the threat is constant and unrelenting, most people eventually collapse. Their minds simply cannot handle the strain anymore. They break down, make mistakes, lose the will to continue. Yarrick understood this better than most. He understood that winning the siege was not just a matter of military tactics, but of psychological warfare, as much against his own soldiers' despair as against the Ork enemy. He created rituals of normalcy within the chaos, scheduled rest periods that were respected no matter what was happening at the front, established small rewards for exceptional performance that gave soldiers something to strive for beyond simple survival. He made the defense of Hades' hive not just a desperate last stand, but a crusade, a sacred duty that gave meaning to the suffering. In most Imperial Guard units, commissars are feared figures whose primary tool is the bolt pistol pressed against the back of a soldier's head. They maintain discipline through terror, executing any who show signs of cowardice or wavering faith. Yarrick operated differently. Not once during the defense of Hades' hive did he execute a soldier for cowardice. He did not need to. His mere presence was enough to stiffen spines and steady hands. Men who might have broken under the weight of fear found themselves standing firm simply because Yarrick was standing beside them.
You know, I have to pause here and share something with you. Out of all the characters in Warhammer 40k, Yarrick genuinely hits different for me. There is something about an ordinary human, no gene enhancements, no power armor, just pure stubbornness and willpower, going toe to toe with monsters and earning their respect. It's the kind of underdog story that never gets old. What really gets me is that moment on Golgotha when Gaskell let him go. That scene lives rent-free in my head. An orc warlord, a creature of pure violence, choosing to spare his enemy because killing him would mean losing the best fight he's ever had. That's not mercy, that's something stranger and honestly more meaningful. It says something about who Yarrick became. Anyway, back to the story.
His courage was contagious, spreading through the ranks like a beneficial infection. As this aspect of Yarrick's leadership deserves deeper examination, because it represents a fundamental departure from standard Imperial doctrine. The Commissariat exists precisely because the Imperium does not trust ordinary humans to stand firm in the face of the galaxy's horrors. The bolt pistol in the Commissar's hand is a constant reminder that death awaits those who fail in their duty, that fleeing from the enemy only exchanges one form of death for another. It is a system designed to extract maximum combat effectiveness from troops whose morale might otherwise collapse. Yarrick had internalized a different truth. He understood that fear of death, while powerful, is ultimately a limited motivator. A soldier who fights only because he fears execution will never be more than adequate. He will do the minimum required to avoid punishment, as conserving his energy and his courage for the moment when survival seems possible. Such a soldier is better than one who runs, but he is far from optimal. The soldier who fights because he believes in what he is fighting for is something else entirely. Such a soldier will push past exhaustion that would stop others. He will take risks that reason says he should avoid. He will become, in moments of crisis, a warrior capable of feats that seem impossible. This is the kind of soldier Yarrick created, not through threats, but through inspiration. His methods were subtle but devastatingly effective. He learned the names of common soldiers, remembering them in the chaos of battle when most commanders would see only uniforms and numbers. He shared their hardships, eating what they ate, suffering what they suffered, never demanding comforts that his troops could not share. He spoke to them not as subjects to be commanded, but as comrades in a shared struggle. And when battle came, he was always at the front, risking himself as readily as he asked them to risk themselves. The result was devotion that transcended ordinary military discipline. The soldiers of Hades' hive did not merely follow Yarrick's orders, they believed in him. They would have followed him into the depths of the warp itself if he asked. They fought not because they feared the consequences of failure, but because they could not bear to disappoint the man who had earned their absolute trust. The Orks noticed this. They always noticed strength. And they began to speak of the human commander who seemed impossible to kill, whose presence turned other humans into worthy opponents. Word of Yarrick spread through the greenskin forces, growing more exaggerated with each telling as Orc stories always do. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka was paying attention, and he decided that this human needed to be dealt with personally. The war boss who descended upon Hades' hive was not Gazkul himself, not yet. He was Ugulhard, one of the mightiest warriors in the entire Green Horde, a monster among monsters who had earned his position through countless acts of brutal violence. Gazkul sent him to break the defenders of Hades' hive, to crush the resistance that had become such an irritating obstacle to the overall campaign. Ugulhard accepted the assignment with savage enthusiasm. The assault came with overwhelming force. Orc warriors poured through the outer defenses of the hive, in their crude weapons, claiming lives with every swing and shot. The defenders fell back, fighting for every meter of ground, making the greenskins pay dearly for their advance. But there were simply too many orcs, an endless green tide that absorbed casualties without slowing. The outer walls fell, then the secondary barriers, then the tertiary defenses. Step by bloody step, the orcs pushed deeper into Hades' hive. And then Commissar Yarrick stepped forward. The confrontation between Yarrick and Ugulhard has become one of the most famous duels in Imperial history, a moment of singular importance that would define both men forever. We do not know exactly what words were exchanged, if any. We do not know the precise sequence of blows that followed. What we know is the outcome, and the outcome was extraordinary. Picture the scene. And the outer defenses of Hades' hive have fallen after brutal fighting that left the streets slick with blood, both red and green. Orc warriors pour through the breaches, howling their savage war cries, their crude weapons dripping with the lives they have already claimed. At their head strides war boss Ugelhard, a monster, even by Orc standards, his massive power claw crackling with energy as it reaches for new victims. The human defenders are falling back as they must. There are simply too many Orcs, and the breaches too wide to hold. In moments, the retreat will become a rout, the rout will become a massacre, and Hades' hive will fall. It has happened to other cities during this war. It will happen to more before the conflict ends. The mathematics of slaughter are brutally simple. But then a single figure steps forward from the retreating human lines. An old man, by the standards of most soldiers. His hair is grey, his face is weathered, his body bears the scars of a lifetime of warfare. He carries a chainsword in one hand and a bolt pistol in the other, weapons that seem almost pathetically small compared to the massive power claw of his approaching opponent. He should be running with the others. He should be seeking safety while there is still time to escape. Instead, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick plants his feet and waits for Ugelhard to come to him. The Orc war boss is delighted. Here, finally, is a human who does not flee like prey. Here is someone who might actually make killing him interesting. Ugelhard bellows a challenge that echoes off the shattered buildings surrounding them. A challenge that is also a laugh, because what chance does this tiny human have against the might of an Orc warlord? Ugelhard was a monster in the truest sense of the word, standing head and shoulders above the tallest human, bulging with muscle that rippled beneath green skin, wielding a power claw that could tear through tank armor like paper. He was everything an Orc warboss should be. Yarrick, by contrast, was an old man, an experienced warrior, yes, a skilled combatant, certainly, but still just a man, without genetic enhancement or power armor, without the advantages that Space Marines enjoy. By any rational measure, the outcome of this fight should have been a foregone conclusion. Yarrick did not care about rational measures. He had stopped caring about such things long ago. On a world called Taos 3, where survival depended on refusing to accept the impossible. The fight was brutal and brief. Ugelhard's power claw caught Yarrick's arm, the crackling energy field shearing through flesh and bone as if they were not there. The Commissar's right arm, severed at the elbow, fell to the bloody ground. For any ordinary human, this would have been the end. The shock alone should have killed him. The blood loss would finish whatever shock began. Yarrick was not an ordinary human. With his remaining hand, he raised his chainsword. The roaring blade bit into Ugelhard's neck, and the warboss's head, its expression frozen in surprise, toppled from its massive shoulders. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Yarrick, his arm ending in a ragged stump that spurted blood with every heartbeat, reached down and wrenched the power claw from Ugelhard's corpse. He held it high, this trophy taken from his enemy, this weapon that had maimed him, turned into a symbol of victory. Around him, the Orcs, who had been pressing forward in the wake of their warboss, stopped. They stared at this human who had killed their leader, who stood bleeding but unbowed, who held the very weapon that had wounded him as proof of his triumph. And then, for the first time in living memory, Orcs ran from a human. The greenskins broke and fled, their courage shattered by the sight of this impossible old man. The human defenders, seeing their enemy retreat, surged forward with renewed vigor, cutting down the fleeing Orcs with a fury that matched anything the greenskins had displayed. Only after the Orcs had been driven from the immediate battlefield did Yarrick allow himself to pass out. He had earned that luxury, and he took it with the same grim determination he brought to everything else. When Yarrick regained consciousness, he learned that his survival had become the most discussed topic in the entire siege. The defenders of Hades' hive spoke of nothing else. They had seen their commissar, their leader, their symbol of defiance, face a monster in single combat, and emerge victorious, despite losing his arm in the process. They had seen him claim his enemy's weapon as a trophy and hold it high for all to see. They had witnessed something that should have been impossible, and in witnessing it, they had gained something precious. Hope. Hope is a strange thing in the grim darkness of the far future. Yet for most Imperial citizens, it is a luxury they cannot afford. Their lives are measured in decades of grinding labor, their horizons limited to the next shift, the next meal, the next brief respite before the cycle begins again. They serve the Emperor because they must, not because they believe their service will lead to anything better. The Imperium endures not through optimism, but through inertia, the sheer momentum of a civilization too massive to fail even as it slowly decays. But in Hades' hive, in the midst of a siege that had already claimed millions of lives, hope had been kindled. The defenders had seen proof that the Orks could be beaten, that even their mightiest warlords could fall to human courage and human determination. If Yarrick could triumph against such odds, then perhaps they could too. Perhaps victory was possible. Perhaps they would survive this nightmare and see the dawn of better days. That hope was Yarrick's greatest weapon, far more powerful than any bolt pistol or chainsword. It spread through the defenders like a fire, burning away doubt and despair, leaving behind only the fierce determination to fight on no matter what. Men and women who had been counting down the days until their inevitable deaths now began counting their kills instead. Units that had been barely holding their positions now began mounting counterattacks, pushing back against the green tide with renewed fury. The entire character of the defense transformed in the wake of Yarrick's victory. The ripples of that transformation spread far beyond Hades' hive. News of Yarrick's triumph traveled across Armageddon, reaching other besieged cities and desperate defenders. Nay, if Hades' hive could hold, perhaps others could too. If one old commissar could kill an Ork warboss in single combat, perhaps victory was possible after all. The psychological impact of Yarrick's stand cannot be overstated. In a war that often seemed hopeless, he gave hope, and hope is the foundation upon which all other virtues are built. Consider, for a moment, what the alternative would have looked like. Had Yarrick fallen to Ugelhard, had Hades' hive collapsed in the aftermath, the entire defense of Armageddon might have crumbled. The refugees from Hades' hive would have joined the already massive columns fleeing across the ash wastes, their despair spreading to every unit they encountered. The legend that grew around Yarrick would never have existed, and the Orks would have faced a demoralized enemy easy to sweep aside. The Space Marines might still have arrived to turn the tide, but they would have found far less to save. Instead, they found an Imperial force that had been transformed by adversity. They found soldiers who had learned to fight Orks and win. They found commanders who had been forged in the fires of siege warfare and emerged stronger for the experience. And they found Sebastian Yarrick, the man who had made it all possible, already planning the next phase of the campaign. The legend that was born that day grew with each passing hour. Within the Ork forces, stories spread of the human who could not be killed, whose gaze brought death to any greenskin who met it. They called him Old Bale Eye, a reference to the evil eye of human superstition, the glare that curses those upon whom it falls. To the Orks, Yarrick had become something more than a mere human. He had become a worthy enemy, a creature to be respected even as he was hated. Yarrick, recovering from his wounds, learned of these stories with interest. Where another commander might have dismissed Ork superstition as irrelevant, Yarrick recognized it for the weapon it could become. He had studied Orks his entire life. He understood that their beliefs had power, that what Orks collectively believed tended to become reality in ways that defied conventional explanation. If the Orks believed he had an evil eye that could kill with a glance, then perhaps he should give them an evil eye worth fearing. When he lost his left eye in a later engagement, possibly to an Ork sniper who had heard the legends and decided to eliminate the threat, Yarrick made a decision that demonstrated his perfect understanding of Ork psychology. He had the damaged eye replaced with a bionic implant, the Bale Eye, which could fire a laser beam powerful enough to burn through an Ork's skull at close range. The Ork said he could kill with a glance. Now he actually could. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Orks who faced Yarrick began to believe they were doomed before the fighting even started. Their belief weakened their resolve, slowed their reactions, turned them into lesser warriors than they would otherwise have been. And because Ork belief has a strange tendency to become reality, Yarrick did seem to become harder to kill, his wounds healing faster, his aim growing more accurate, his presence on the battlefield becoming something that approached the supernatural. This was not magic in the conventional sense. It was something stranger, the interaction between human will and Ork gestalt consciousness, the way that the belief of millions of greenskins could subtly reshape reality around a single figure. Yarrick had become, in a sense, an Ork legend, and Ork legends have power. To truly understand this phenomenon, you must understand something about the nature of Orks themselves. The greenskins are not merely a brutal alien species. They are something far stranger. Their biology is part fungal, their reproduction involves spores rather than conventional genetics, and their technology should not work by any rational scientific principle. Ork guns are often little more than crude pipes with triggering mechanisms, yet they fire projectiles with devastating force. Ork vehicles are welded together from salvage and wishful thinking, yet they roar across battlefields at impossible speeds. The explanation for this lies in the Ork gestalt consciousness, a psychic field generated by the collective belief of the greenskin species. When enough Orks believe something should work, it does. When enough Orks believe a vehicle should be fast, it becomes fast. When enough Orks believe a weapon should be deadly, it becomes deadly. This is not superstition or folklore. It is documented scientific fact, studied by the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Ordo Xenos for millennia. The implications are profound and troubling, because they suggest that the Orks' greatest weapon is not their numbers or their savagery, but their very belief. Yarrick had intuited this truth long before the scholars of the Imperium confirmed it. But from his childhood on Taos 3, he had observed how Ork belief shaped Ork reality. He had watched their technology function in defiance of all engineering principles. He had seen how their morale could shift in an instant, based on perceived omens and portents. And he had realized that this phenomenon could be exploited, turned against the greenskins, by a commander clever enough to understand how it worked. The Baali was his masterstroke. By giving the Orks a tangible symbol of their superstitious fears, Yarrick had anchored their belief in his invincibility to something they could see and understand. Every time an Ork witnessed the Baali fire its laser beam, every time they heard stories of humans killed by Yarrick's gaze, the legend grew stronger. And as the legend grew stronger, so did its power. Yet the Orks expected Yarrick to be unstoppable, so he became unstoppable. They expected him to survive wounds that should kill him, so he survived. Their belief shaped reality, and Yarrick had learned to shape their belief. This understanding of Ork psychology was perhaps Yarrick's most valuable asset, more important even than his tactical brilliance or his personal courage. He knew how Orks thought. He could predict their reactions to stimuli that most human commanders would never consider. He understood their hierarchies, their rituals, their strengths, and their weaknesses. This knowledge, accumulated over a lifetime of study and combat, gave him an edge that no amount of firepower could replicate. For 6 months following Ugelhard's defeat, the defenders of Hades' hive held their ground. Gazgkul threw strategy after strategy against them, probing for weaknesses, testing every possible approach. Commandos infiltrated through the sewer tunnels, only to be met by tunnel fighters who knew every twist and turn of the underhive. Stormboys dropped from the skies, only to be shredded by anti-aircraft fire that Yarrick had positioned with perfect precision. Siege engines rumbled forward, only to be sabotaged by human suicide teams who gladly gave their lives to destroy the massive machines. Every move Gazgkul made, Yarrick countered. It was as if the commissar could read the war boss's mind, anticipating each attack before it came. In truth, Yarrick was simply applying everything he had learned about Ork behavior over his long life, predicting their actions based on deep understanding rather than psychic insight. But to the Orks, It seemed like something more. It seemed like the human could see the future. Eventually, Ghazghkull decided that the situation required his personal attention. The war boss, who had conquered worlds and shattered armies, came to Hades' hive to deal with the human who had defied him for so long. The battle that followed was apocalyptic, even by the standards of Armageddon. Ghazghkull brought the full weight of his horde to bear, determined to crush Yarrick and his defenders through sheer overwhelming force. When Ghazghkull himself fell upon the hive, Yarrick recognized that further resistance was futile. The defenders had held longer than anyone had any right to expect, but they could not hold forever against such numbers. With characteristic pragmatism, he ordered an evacuation. In a series of daring shuttle runs, the remaining forces escaped Hades' hive, carrying with them the survivors of months of brutal siege warfare. Yarrick himself was among the last to leave. He faced Ghazghkull in combat during the final hours of the evacuation, receiving wounds that brought him to the very edge of death. As his consciousness faded during the flight to safety, he did not know whether he would wake again. He did wake, of course, and when he did, he learned that the tide of war had finally turned. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels had arrived at Armageddon with a force of Space Marines drawn from multiple chapters. The Salamanders, Ultramarines, and Blood Angels had responded to the desperate calls for help that Yarrick had sent before von Straub's bungling silenced the planet's communications. And now they fell upon the Ork forces with all the fury that the Emperor's finest could muster. Hermann von Straub was arrested for crimes against the Imperium, his incompetence finally catching up with him. The defense of Armageddon was reorganized under competent leadership, with Space Marine chapter masters coordinating with Imperial Guard commanders to mount a proper counteroffensive. The tide began to turn, but even as the larger war shifted in humanity's favor, something remarkable happened. The people of Armageddon and the wider Imperium recognized who had truly saved them during the darkest hours of the conflict. It was not the Space Marines, though they had certainly been essential to final victory. It was not the Titan Legions or the Imperial Navy, though their contributions were vital. It was Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. It's the man who had held Hades' hive against impossible odds, who had given the Imperium time to respond. Yarrick was hailed as the savior of Armageddon. His defense of Hades' hive was recognized as the turning point of the entire war, the moment when Ork momentum was broken and Imperial resistance began to coalesce. Medals were awarded, commendations were written, songs were sung in his honor across 1,000 worlds. And Yarrick, being Yarrick, immediately started planning his next campaign. In 944 of the 41st Millennium, 3 years after the end of the Second War for Armageddon, Yarrick formally came out of retirement. He had never truly accepted that the war was over, not while Ghazghkull still lived. The war boss had escaped the Imperial counteroffensive, retreating into the void with the remnants of his forces. As long as he survived, he remained a threat, and Yarrick had learned enough about Ghazghkull to know that the Ork would not be content with a single defeat. He would return. He would always return. The Commissar requested a military expedition to cleanse the surrounding worlds of Ork raiders, making no secret of his true objective: to hunt down and kill Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. The Imperium, recognizing the value of eliminating such a dangerous enemy, granted his request. Yarrick gathered his forces, including his personal Baneblade super heavy tank, christened the Fortress of Arrogance, and set out into the void. The name of his tank tells you something about Yarrick's state of mind at this point in his life. Arrogance is generally considered a sin in Imperial doctrine, a form of pride that leads to destruction. But Yarrick chose to embrace it, to weaponize it, to make his confidence in himself so overwhelming that it became a force multiplier. He was arrogant because he had earned the right to be arrogant. He had done what no other human had done, and he intended to do more still. The Fortress of Arrogance was a fitting command vehicle for such a man. A Baneblade is already one of the most powerful war machines the Imperium can field. A super-heavy tank whose main cannon can devastate fortifications and whose secondary weapons can shred infantry and armor alike. Yarrick's Baneblade was further modified with a command cupola that allowed him to direct his forces while still participating in the battle, and with special communications equipment that could coordinate operations across an entire war zone. It was a mobile fortress, as a statement of imperial might, and a symbol of everything Yarrick had become. What followed was a campaign of pursuit that took Yarrick across multiple systems. He tracked Ghazghkull from world to world, always arriving just after the warboss had moved on, always one step behind his prey. The hunt became an obsession, consuming Yarrick's every waking moment. He would not rest, could not rest, until Ghazghkull was dead. We should pause here to consider the nature of this obsession. Yarrick was no longer a young man. The years of war had taken their toll on his body, requiring augmetic replacements and rejuvenate treatments to keep him functional. A reasonable person in his position might have accepted that Ghazghkull had escaped, that the threat had been neutralized for now, whilst that the time had come to pass the torch to younger warriors and enjoy whatever peace retirement could offer. But Yarrick was not a reasonable person. He had never been a reasonable person. His entire career had been built on refusing to accept what reason said was inevitable, and he knew something that the bureaucrats and administrators who questioned his crusade could not understand. Ghazghkull would return. The warboss was not finished with Armageddon, was not finished with humanity, was not finished with Yarrick himself. Their story was not complete. It could only end with one of them dead. This certainty drove Yarrick forward, even when logic said he should turn back. It pushed him through campaigns that cost thousands of lives, through setbacks that would have convinced any other commander to abandon the hunt. Ghazghkull had become the focus of Yarrick's existence, the enemy whose destruction would justify everything he had suffered and everything he had sacrificed. To abandon the hunt would be to admit that all of it had been for nothing. On the world of Golgotha, Yarrick finally cornered his quarry. Or so he thought. Golgotha was a world of mountains, sandy plains, and rocky outcrops, its atmosphere thick and its gravity slightly higher than standard. It was exactly the kind of harsh environment where Orks thrived, and Ghazghkull had fortified it extensively during his retreat from Armageddon. Yarrick led his forces into a canyon in the Ishawa mountain range, confident that he had at last brought the warboss to bay. The canyon was a place of harsh beauty, its walls rising sheer and red on either side of the advancing imperial column. The fortress of arrogance rumbled at the head of the procession, its massive bulk comforting in its solidity, its weapons ready to unleash devastation on any enemy foolish enough to stand against it. Behind it came ranks of chimeras and Lehman Russ battle tanks, infantry carriers, and support vehicles, the full might of an imperial expedition trained and equipped to destroy the Ork menace once and for all. Yarrick stood in the cupola of his Baneblade, surveying the terrain with eyes that had seen 100 battlefields. Something felt wrong, though he could not identify what. The canyon was too quiet. The Ork forces they had been pursuing had vanished into its depths, without leaving the usual trail of destruction and debris that marked greenskin movements. It was almost as if they had simply evaporated, as absorbed by the red stone of the mountains. And then the mountains came alive. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. Ghazghkull had not merely retreated to Golgotha. He had prepared it as a killing ground, luring Yarrick into a position from which there was no escape. A second Ork force, equally as large as the one Yarrick had been pursuing, emerged to block his retreat. The canyon walls erupted with green bodies, Orks pouring from concealed positions in numbers that beggared belief. They had been waiting, buried in the rock itself, holding their violence in check, until the perfect moment to unleash it. The trap closed around Yarrick's force, like jaws around prey. Behind them, ahead of them, above them on the canyon walls, Orks appeared from every direction. The Imperial column, so confident moments before, and found itself surrounded and under fire from all sides. Discipline held at first. The tanks formed defensive formations. The infantry deployed to cover the vehicles. The guns spoke their thunderous language of destruction. But there were simply too many Orks. For every greenskin that fell, 3 more appeared to take its place. The Imperial vehicles, confined in the narrow canyon, could not maneuver effectively. The infantry, exposed to fire from the elevated positions on the canyon walls, took horrific casualties. And through it all, Gazgkul's laughter echoed off the stone, a booming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Battle of Golgotha was a catastrophe. Yarrick's fortress of arrogance was crippled by an Ork stomper, the massive war machine leaving the Baneblade a smoking ruin. But the Imperial forces were systematically destroyed, their coordinated resistance crumbling under the weight of Ork numbers. And Yarrick himself, fighting to the last as he always did, was captured alive. For any other prisoner, what followed would have been simple execution. Orks do not typically keep human prisoners for long, finding them unsuitable for slavery and uninteresting as entertainment. But Yarrick was not any other prisoner. He was Old Baali, the human who had defied Gazkul on Armageddon, the only worthy enemy the war boss had ever faced. His fate would be different. The torture began immediately. Yarrick was stripped of his bionic eye and his power claw, the symbols of his legend taken from him piece by piece. He was beaten, burned, subjected to agonies that would have broken lesser men. But Yarrick did not break. That he endured, as he had always endured, drawing on reserves of willpower that seemed bottomless. When the torture failed to shatter his spirit, Gazkul tried a different approach. Yarrick was thrown into a pit filled with refuse and scavenging squigs, left to die among the garbage of the Ork space hulk. It should have been the end. No human could survive for long in such conditions. Yarrick hunted the squigs. He killed them with his bare hands and improvised weapons, using their own bodies as tools for survival. He ate what he had to eat, did what he had to do, and refused to die. Eventually, using the massive quills of the squigs he had slain, he built a ladder and climbed back up the waste chute that had dropped him into hell. When he emerged, Gazkul was waiting for him. The war boss had known all along that Yarrick would survive, that he had been watching, testing, evaluating this human who had become such a fascinating opponent. And now, with Yarrick standing before him, stripped of his augments and covered in filth but unbroken, Gazkul made a decision that shocked everyone present. He ordered Yarrick released. The war boss provided a shuttle, a small craft barely capable of reaching orbit. He told Yarrick that good enemies were hard to come by, that the planned reinvasion of Armageddon would be much more entertaining with Yarrick leading the defense. It was not mercy. Orks do not understand mercy. It was something else, something that only made sense in the context of Ork culture. The Orks have a concept they call scumgrod, which translates roughly as favorite enemy. It refers to an opponent so enjoyable to fight that killing them would be a loss, and because then you would not be able to fight them anymore. This is a difficult concept for humans to understand, because for most of us, the purpose of fighting is to defeat our enemies definitively. We fight to win, and winning means the enemy is destroyed. But Orks do not think this way. For an Ork, fighting is not a means to an end. Fighting is the end, the purpose, the greatest joy that existence can offer. A good fight is more precious than gold, more satisfying than the conquest of worlds, more meaningful than any achievement the universe can provide. And a truly great opponent, someone who provides fight after fight after fight, is the rarest treasure of all. Gazgkul had decided that Yarrick was his scumgrod, his perfect opponent, the one worthy human in a galaxy of weaklings. Killing him would have been wasteful, or setting him free, allowing him to prepare for the next confrontation, was far more satisfying. There would be other battles, other chances to test himself against this remarkable human. The war between them was not over. It was only pausing to catch its breath. Consider what this means about how Gazkul perceived Yarrick. In the Ork worldview, humans are generally beneath contempt. They are weak, soft, unable to provide the kind of satisfying combat that Orks crave. Even Space Marines, those genetically enhanced warriors who can match an Ork in single combat, are often viewed as merely acceptable opponents, rather than truly worthy ones. But Yarrick, an ordinary human without genetic enhancement or power armor, had earned something that most of his species never could: respect. This respect was not admiration in the human sense. Gazgakol did not think Yarrick was a good person or wish him well. He wanted to fight him, to test himself against him, to eventually kill him in glorious combat. But he wanted that death to mean something. He wanted Yarrick at his best, leading armies, making war, providing the kind of opposition that made victory worthwhile. A quick execution in the bowels of a space hulk would have robbed Gazkul of the epic confrontation he craved. Yarrick left Golgotha in the shuttle Gazkul had provided, but he did not stay gone for long. He returned with a force drawn from the Adeptus Mechanicus, including Titans, and the massive weapon known as the Ordinatus Golgotha. The world was scoured of Orks, Yarrick's vengeance exacted in fire and death. But Gazkul escaped again, as he always seemed to escape. And 57 years to the day after the first Ork invasion of Armageddon, the warboss returned to that world for another round of their endless war. The third war for Armageddon began on the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, 998 of the 41st Millennium. It was deliberate timing, a message from Gazkul to Yarrick and to the Imperium at large. The warboss remembered. He always remembered. The invasion fleet that emerged from the warp made the force of the Second War look like a minor raid. 50 Ork cruisers, over 300 escort vessels, and at least 4 space hulks descended upon the Armageddon system. The monitor station Dante was destroyed in mid-transmission, cut off before it could fully report the scale of the threat. The Imperial Navy scrambled to respond, but they were badly outnumbered. Try to imagine the scale of what was descending upon Armageddon. 4 space hulks, each a massive conglomeration of ships fused together over millennia, some stretching for kilometers in every direction. 300 escort vessels, each capable of devastating entire cities with their weapons. 50 cruisers, the backbone of Ork void warfare, crewed by thousands of greenskins eager for slaughter. And within these vessels, packed in conditions that no human could endure, millions upon millions of Ork warriors, waiting for the signal to descend. The first Ork landing had nearly destroyed Armageddon, despite the relative inferiority of Gazkul's forces at the time. This invasion would dwarf that effort in every way. Gazkul had spent 57 years preparing for this moment, gathering forces from across the galaxy, uniting tribes that had warred against each other for centuries under his banner. He had studied his defeat in the Second War, learning from every mistake, identifying every weakness in Imperial defenses. This time, he intended to leave nothing to chance. Yarrick arrived on Armageddon 2 weeks before the invasion began. By overwhelming vote, he was offered supreme command of all Imperial forces on the planet. He accepted, of course. This was the war he had been preparing for his entire life. The weight of that command cannot be overstated. Yarrick was being asked to take responsibility for the defense of one of the most strategically important worlds in the entire Imperium. Billions of lives depended on his decisions. The fate of entire sectors might hang on whether Armageddon held or fell, but most commanders would have been paralyzed by the magnitude of such responsibility. Yarrick accepted it without hesitation, as if it was simply the next item on a list of tasks to be completed. Before the fighting started, Yarrick had the Fortress of Arrogance retrieved from Golgotha. The Baneblade had remained on that world for decades, abandoned in the wake of his defeat. Now it was restored by the Mechanicus, refitted with a special armored cupola that would serve as Yarrick's command platform. From this pulpit, he would lead his armies against the Green Tide. Gazkul's first move was characteristically dramatic and brutal. He did not send his forces against Hades' hive. He destroyed it entirely, obliterating the city from orbit with a massive asteroid launched from one of his space hulks. It was a message, a declaration that there would be no repeat of the last war, that the places Yarrick had defended would simply be erased. But Yarrick had anticipated this. He knew Gazkul understood how the warboss thought. Where another commander might have concentrated forces to defend Hades' hive, Yarrick had ordered its evacuation. The city was empty when the asteroid struck. Millions of potential casualties became none. The war that followed was beyond anything Armageddon had experienced before. More than 25 Space Marine chapters committed forces to the defense, including the Black Templars under Reclusiarch Grimaldus, who would earn his own legend in the defense of Hive Hell's Reach. Titan legions strode across the ash wastes, their massive war machines dueling with Ork gargants in battles that shook the earth for kilometers around. The Imperial Guard deployed in numbers that defied comprehension, regiment after regiment pouring into the meat grinder of Armageddon's defense. The scale of the conflict must be understood to appreciate what it demanded of its commanders. Armageddon is a world of billions, its population spread across massive hive cities that tower toward the sky like metal mountains. Each of these hive cities became a battlefield. Each district, each hab block, each corridor and stairwell saw fighting that would have been legendary on a lesser world. Men and women who would never be remembered in any history book gave their lives in countless small actions that, taken together, determined the fate of the planet. Yarrick had to coordinate all of this. He had to make decisions that would send millions to their deaths or spare them, or decisions that would determine which cities held and which fell, decisions that would shape the course of the entire war. And he had to make these decisions under constant pressure, with incomplete information, while the enemy probed his defenses looking for any weakness to exploit. The burden would have crushed most commanders. They would have second-guessed themselves, hesitated at critical moments, allowed doubt to paralyze them when action was needed. Yarrick did not hesitate. He made his decisions with the same certainty he had shown throughout his career, trusting his knowledge of the enemy and his understanding of his own forces. When his decisions were right, he pressed the advantage. When they were wrong, he adapted and tried something else. He never looked back, never wasted time on regret, and never allowed past failures to undermine present confidence. Yarrick was everywhere. He led armored assaults from the cupola of the Fortress of Arrogance, his voice carrying over the Vox to rally soldiers who might otherwise have broken under the strain. He directed defensive operations that turned Ork advances into bloodbaths. He made the decisions that no one else wanted to make, sacrificing units and positions when necessary, preserving forces when preservation was possible. His cold military logic saved countless lives, even as his personal courage inspired those lives to fight harder than they ever had before. There is something remarkable about watching an old man lead a war. Youth brings certain advantages to command: energy, aggression, the willingness to take risks that older minds would find unacceptable. But age brings advantages of its own: experience, judgment, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent studying warfare. Yarrick combined the aggression of youth with the wisdom of age, attacking relentlessly while avoiding the foolish risks that destroy armies. He was, in every sense, a master of his craft. But for all his efforts, the war ground towards stalemate. Ghazghkull was simply too powerful, his forces too numerous, his strategies too unpredictable. The Imperium could not drive the Orks from Armageddon, and the Orks could not overcome the Imperial defenses. The conflict settled into a brutal war of attrition, with both sides bleeding resources into an endless cycle of attack and counterattack. And then, as suddenly as he had arrived, Ghazghkull left. The reasons for Ghazghkull's departure from Armageddon are complex, yet rooted in the unique psychology of Ork leadership and the visions that drove the war boss's actions. According to his grot companion Makari, Ghazghkull had grown bored with the stalemate. More importantly, he had begun experiencing visions again, messages from Gork and Mork that suggested a grander purpose awaited him elsewhere. He left the conquest of Armageddon to his subordinate warlords and departed to begin what he called the Great Green Crusade. When word of Ghazghkull's departure reached Yarrick, the Commissar did not celebrate. He knew that his enemy's escape meant the beginning of something terrible, a green tide that would sweep across the galaxy if not stopped. The war on Armageddon was not truly over. It would continue for years, perhaps decades. As the remaining Orc forces fought for dominance and Imperial commanders sought to reclaim every lost inch of ground. But the heart of the conflict had moved on, following Ghazghkull into the void. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars shared Yarrick's assessment. He organized a crusade to pursue Ghazghkull, determined to end the threat before it could grow beyond all control. And when Yarrick petitioned to join this crusade, Helbrecht agreed. It was a remarkable arrangement. Commissars do not typically serve alongside Space Marines. The two arms of Imperial military power operate in separate spheres, their cultures and methods too different for easy integration. But Helbrecht recognized something in Yarrick that transcended normal boundaries. Here was a human who had earned the respect of Orks, who had fought toe-to-toe with warlords and emerged victorious, who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of pursuit. If any human could help the Black Templars find and destroy Ghazghkull, it was Sebastian Yarrick. The Black Templars themselves were a fitting choice for this crusade. Of all the Space Marine chapters, the Black Templars are perhaps the most devoted to the complete destruction of humanity's enemies. They do not maintain a single homeworld, but instead crusade across the galaxy in perpetual war, seeking out threats to the Imperium wherever they may lurk. Their High Marshal, Helbrecht, was the finest naval commander in the Adeptus Astartes, a warrior whose tactical genius in void warfare was matched only by his personal courage in boarding actions. For Yarrick to be accepted by such warriors was itself an honor beyond measure. Space Marines typically view ordinary humans as something between children and pets, valuable but fundamentally inferior. They fight alongside the Imperial Guard when necessary, but rarely consider individual guardsmen worthy of their attention. That Helbrecht would not only accept Yarrick's petition, but actually welcome his participation speaks volumes about the reputation the Commissar had earned. The Crusade fleet that departed Armageddon was an impressive force by any standard. Battle barges and strike cruisers, escorted by swarms of smaller vessels, pushed into the void in pursuit of Ghazghkull's flagship. The Kill Wrecker, named with typical Orc subtlety, had fled into the depths of space, leading its pursuers on a chase that would span systems and years. The hunt that followed took Yarrick and Helbrecht across the galaxy. They tracked Ghazghkull through the Haunted Gulf, a region of space where the boundaries between reality and the warp grow thin. The nature of this region made pursuit difficult. Ships that entered the Haunted Gulf sometimes emerged in unexpected locations, or at unexpected times, or did not emerge at all. But the Black Templars were not deterred by such hazards. They had sworn to destroy Ghazghkull, and they would follow him into the Eye of Terror itself if that was what it took. The pursuit became something of a legend in its own right. Stories spread through the Imperium of the relentless crusade that hunted the galaxy's most dangerous Orc, of the ancient Commissar who would not rest until his enemy was dead, as of the Space Marines who had sworn oaths that bound them to this quest until its completion. For the defenders of distant worlds threatened by Orc invasion, these stories were a source of hope. Someone was fighting back, someone was carrying the war to the enemy, someone was proving that the Greenskins could be pursued, could be cornered, could be destroyed. They cornered his flagship, the Kill Wrecker, in a battle that seemed certain to end the warboss's threat forever, and then Ghazghkull escaped, again. In a blaze of green energy that suggested divine intervention, warp spawned or otherwise, the Kill Wrecker vanished into the Imperium. The crusade was left with nothing but empty space where their target had been moments before. Yarrick, watching the spot where his enemy had disappeared, knew that the escape meant disaster for the Imperium. Ghazghkull would reappear somewhere else, stronger than before, ready to begin his great Green Crusade in earnest. The years that followed saw Ghazghkull emerge in the Octarius sector, where he united the feuding Orc factions and led them in a massive war against Hive Fleet Leviathan. The war boss was even swallowed by a Morlock at one point, only to tear his way out of the creature's belly and resume his rampage. Nothing, it seemed, could stop him. Nothing could end the threat he represented. And throughout it all, Yarrick continued the pursuit. Growing older, his body increasingly maintained by bionics and the medical arts of the Imperium, the Commissar refused to abandon his mission. Kazkul was his enemy, his scumgrod, his purpose. As long as the war boss lived, Yarrick would hunt him. The current fate of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick is uncertain. Reports from the Divisio Mortis of the Officio Prefectus suggest that he may have finally fallen. His long life ended by the very war he had dedicated himself to fighting. The Bell of Lost Souls on Holy Terror is said to have tolled for him, that ancient instrument that rings only for the greatest heroes of the Imperium. If the reports are true, then one of humanity's most legendary warriors has passed beyond the veil. But in the grim darkness of the far future, death is rarely certain. The Imperium has a long history of what might be called factual creativity, declaring heroes dead when they are merely missing, or concealing their survival for reasons of propaganda or security. Other legendary figures have been declared killed only to return, their apparent deaths serving some larger purpose in the endless game of galactic warfare. Perhaps Yarrick has truly died. Perhaps his mortal body, maintained for so long by willpower and augmentation, has finally given out. Perhaps he has joined the Emperor at last, his watch ended, his duty complete. Or perhaps, somewhere in the vastness of space, an old man with a bionic eye and a stolen orc weapon continues his hunt. Perhaps the legend of old Baelai is not yet finished. Perhaps there are battles still to be fought, enemies still to be faced, chapters yet to be written in the story of the man the Orks respect. The uncertainty itself is fitting. Yarrick has always been a figure who existed on the boundary between life and death, between possible and impossible. When he has survived so many things that should have killed him, that death itself seems to hesitate before claiming him. The Orks believe he cannot die, and as we have discussed, Ork belief has power. Perhaps, in some strange way, their collective conviction that old Baelai is immortal has made him so. Perhaps he continues to fight somewhere beyond Imperial communication, his body kept moving by the same stubborn will that has always defined him. Or perhaps the Bell of Lost Souls speaks truly, and Sebastian Yarrick has finally found rest. If so, he earned it. No one could say that he did not give everything he had to the cause he served. No one could accuse him of holding anything back, of preserving himself when others needed him, of choosing safety over duty. He lived as he believed, fought as he preached, on and remained true to his principles until the very end. Either way, his legacy is secure. The wars he fought are written in the histories of 1,000 worlds. The soldiers he inspired have gone on to inspire others, creating chains of courage that extend far beyond anything Yarrick himself ever witnessed. The strategies he developed are studied in military academies across the Imperium, and the legend of old Baelai continues to grow, as legends do, becoming something larger than the man who inspired it. What matters is not whether Yarrick lives or dies. What matters is what he represents. In a universe where humanity is beset on all sides by enemies that defy comprehension, where the average human life is measured in decades of toil and terror, where even the greatest heroes are often consumed by the wars they fight, while Yarrick stands as proof that the human spirit cannot be broken. He was not genetically enhanced like a space marine. He was not blessed by the gods of chaos or empowered by alien technology. He was simply a man, a human being with no advantages beyond his own determination. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Yarrick's legend. In the Imperium of Man, where super soldiers walk the battlefield and god machines stride across continents, ordinary humans often feel insignificant. They look at the space marines in their power armor, at the titans that tower over cities, at the psychic might of the Inquisition and the mechanical mastery of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and they cannot help but feel small. They are told that they matter, that their service is valued, but the truth is more complicated. As in the vast equations of galactic warfare, ordinary human lives are often treated as expendable resources, spent without hesitation when the situation demands it. Yarrick's existence is a refutation of this calculus. He proves that an ordinary human, armed with nothing but courage and determination, can accomplish feats that rival those of superhuman warriors. He proves that the measure of a man is not his genetic heritage or his technological advantages, but his willingness to stand firm against the darkness. He proves that the human spirit, when properly cultivated and directed, is a weapon more powerful than any bolter or power sword, and yet he earned the respect of a species that respects nothing but strength. He fought a war boss to a standstill and walked away with his enemy's weapon as a trophy. He survived capture, torture, and abandonment that would have killed anyone else. He led armies to victories that changed the course of galactic history. He became a legend among humans and orcs alike, a figure spoken of with reverence across 1,000 worlds. The orcs call him Old Baal Eye. The people of Armageddon call him the Old Man. The archives of the Imperium call him the Savior of Armageddon, the hero of Hades' hive, the one who held the line when all seemed lost. These titles describe different aspects of the same remarkable individual, a man who refused to accept defeat regardless of the odds, who understood his enemies better than anyone else in the Imperium, and who fought not for glory or recognition, but because fighting was necessary. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick understood something that many in the Imperium have forgotten. He understood that humanity's greatest strength is not its armies or its weapons or its technology. It is the will to endure, the refusal to surrender, the stubborn determination to keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless. This is what the Orks respect. This is what makes a human worthy in their savage eyes. Not genetic superiority or divine blessing, but the simple, indomitable will to stand and fight. There is a lesson here for all of us who live in dark times. Whether that darkness takes the form of alien invasion or the more mundane challenges of everyday existence. The universe does not care about our struggles. It does not reward effort or punish cowardice. It simply is, vast and indifferent, and those who survive within it are those who refuse to stop trying. Yarrick never stopped trying. When he was orphaned at 7, he kept trying. When he was alone on a world conquered by orcs, he kept trying. When he faced war bosses in single combat with no reasonable expectation of victory, he kept trying. When he was captured, tortured, and thrown into a pit to die, he kept trying. Every obstacle that should have defeated him instead became fuel for his determination. Every failure taught him something that made the next attempt more likely to succeed. This is the quality that the Orks recognized in him. Not his tactical brilliance, though that was considerable. Not his personal combat prowess, though that exceeded what most humans could achieve. What the Orks saw in Yarrick was a kindred spirit, someone who embodied the same relentless aggression that defines their entire species. He was, in their eyes, more orc than most humans could ever hope to be. And coming from orcs, that is the highest compliment possible. In the end, that is the lesson of Yarrick's life. You do not need to be superhuman to be a hero. You do not need special gifts or cosmic advantages. You need only the courage to face your fears, the wisdom to understand your enemies, and the will to keep going when everything tells you to stop. These are qualities available to any human being who chooses to cultivate them. They are the inheritance of every child born into the Imperium, regardless of their station or their circumstances. The galaxy is a dark place, filled with horrors beyond imagination. The enemies of humanity are legion, and they will never stop coming. The war will continue as long as there are humans to fight it, and probably long after the last human has fallen. But as long as there are men and women who embody the spirit of Sebastian Yarrick, who refuse to bow to despair, who stand firm against the darkness, then humanity has a chance. That is the legacy of Old Baal Eye. That is what he teaches us, through his deeds and his sacrifices and his unbreakable will, that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there can also be hope. The story of Sebastian Yarrick is not finished. It may never be finished, not truly. Even if the man himself has passed beyond the veil, his legend continues to inspire. On 1,000 worlds, Imperial guardsmen whisper his name before battle. In the training academies of the Schola Progenium, his life is studied as an example of what ordinary humans can achieve. Among the Orks themselves, his name is spoken with something that might, in their savage way, be called reverence. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to Yarrick's memory. He bridged the gap between two species that should have had nothing in common, demonstrating that courage and determination are universal values that transcend biology. The Orks respect him because they recognize in him the same qualities they prize in themselves: the refusal to surrender, the joy of combat, the absolute commitment to being the strongest. Humanity can be proud that such a man arose from their ranks. For those of us who live in less dramatic times, who face challenges that seem mundane compared to the nightmares of the 41st millennium, Yarrick's story still has lessons to offer. We may not be called upon to fight alien invaders or lead armies across devastated worlds, but we all face our own battles, our own moments when surrender seems like the easier option, our own choices between giving up and fighting on. In those moments, we can ask ourselves what Yarrick would do. And the answer is always the same. He would stand firm. He would refuse to accept defeat. He would find a way to win or die trying. That is the gift he gives us across the gulf of millennia. Not a weapon or a technology, but an example. The example of a man who became more than he was supposed to be, who rose above his limitations through nothing but his own determination, who proved that the human spirit is capable of achievements that seem impossible. If he could do what he did, then perhaps we can do what we need to do. Perhaps we are stronger than we know. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of tonight's exploration into the legend of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. From a frightened orphan hiding from Orks on Taos 3 to the most respected human in the galaxy. His story is one of the most inspiring in all of Warhammer 40,000. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through his life and his wars, and I hope his example has given you something to think about. Whether you first encountered Yarrick through the tabletop game, through the novels of David Annandale, or through conversations with fellow fans of the setting, there is something in his story that resonates with everyone who hears it. Perhaps it is the image of the old man standing firm against the monster, refusing to give ground despite his age and his wounds. Perhaps it is the relationship between hunter and hunted, predator and prey. Yes, that defines his connection to Ghazghkull. Perhaps it is simply the fantasy of being respected by one's enemies, of becoming so formidable that even those who hate you must acknowledge your strength. Whatever draws you to Yarrick's story, I hope tonight's exploration has deepened your appreciation for it. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 is vast and deep, full of heroes and villains, tragedies and triumphs. But few characters exemplify the setting's themes as perfectly as Commissar Yarrick. He is humanity at its finest, fighting against odds that should be overwhelming, refusing to accept that victory is impossible. He is the spirit of defiance that keeps the Imperium standing despite all the forces arrayed against it. If you found this content valuable, please consider subscribing to Q on 40k and hitting that like button. While your support helps me continue creating these deep dives into the rich lore of the 41st millennium. Whether you're a long-time fan of the setting or just discovering the grim darkness for the first time, there's always more to explore, more legends to uncover, more stories to tell. Until next time, remember the words of Commissar Yarrick himself. Heroes of Armageddon, you have withstood the evil savagery of the Orks, and they have nothing left for you to fear. So raise high the black banners of vengeance. Now is our time. May the Emperor protect you all.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.